And welcome back, everybody. It has been a few months since I last posted a deck profile on my branded build, and that's because I've been working on changing it up and just testing out different things to see what ends up working out for me, and also trying to go to locals as much as I can, though I haven't really had a lot of opportunities to go. And just see what the landscape is like, what Kashira is like, what everyone else is playing. And at the moment, it seems like my locals is currently riddled with Kashira variants, with the exception of maybe one Sprite player and then one other Branded player, since Branded is pretty much back. Not from the dead, of course, since this deck has always been pretty good, and we are going to dive into my build. So this is a build that I've been working on for the past couple of months, and one that I am still tweaking today, but I would like to go in depth as to all of my choices here and why I went for every card and each ratio that I opted for. So without any further ado, let's get straight into the main deck. So first things first, we are going to go with the double Blazing Cartesia. So I've actually been a fan of double Blazing Cartesia since she was released all the way back in October of 2022. I just think that she is a really powerful card, especially if you're not running polymerization. She will make it a lot easier for you to be able to fuse and combo off in so many different ways. But now you would want two copies of her because of the fusion that is now included with the latest set of Photon Hypernova. So we are going to now move on to the rest of the cards, of course. So over here we've got triple Fallen of Albaz, and this is another ratio that has not changed at all either. This is because I believe that I do need three, considering that I'm constantly cycling through resources. Regardless of whether or not Kashira will end up banishing one of my copies of Fallen of Albaz or anything like that, or Bystials from mirror matches, having three Albaz is, in my opinion, the best way to go because, at least for me, I'm always cycling through all three copies of him, and making sure that I have ways of recycling him and just guaranteeing myself that I will always have at least one copy available of Fallen of Albaz is extremely important, especially in a deck like this. So I simply do not want to risk going for anything less than three. That has been the case for a while, and I think that argument only remains stronger with this current format. Next up, we've got triple Aluber, the Jester of Despia. So Aluber is going to be your main searcher when it comes to your branded spells and traps, particularly spells, since that's mostly what you're going to be using Aluber for to search for branded fusion or branded loss and that kind of thing. So Aluber at 3 is still an absolute must. These ratios have not changed since I made my last deck profile. However, one ratio that has changed is going to be my single Despian Tragedy. I just don't really think that, well, I think that I should actually elaborate on that a little bit better. Just considering that this deck is 45 cards and everything is so tight as it is already, Tragedy just had to be one of the cards that I ended up cutting because Tragedy isn't really a card that is as beneficial in my opinion as it used to be, just because of how I like to run my deck. I think that Tragedy is still a pretty useful card, but I'm fairly happy just getting to use him once per duel, and then that's fine. I don't find myself missing the second copy whatsoever. So even though the asymmetry is there, I have to live with the fact that Tragedy just isn't really as good in this deck, at least in my build, as he was once upon a time. Then we are going for Dramaturge for the last Despia card, and yes, you heard me correctly. This is the last Despia card. I'm actually not a fan of ad libitum so much anymore. I did experiment with ad libitum for some time, and I was able to learn a lot about how ad libitum works. However, I'm somebody that likes to go for a lot of double masquerade lines, and I like being able to recycle resources to be able to go into some more fusions. And the fact that when you use Dramaturge as a fusion material, he brings himself right back out at 3,000 attack is really valuable, but you can also just reuse him for another fusion if you need to. He makes it a lot easier to be able to make two masquerades, and it really helps out a lot, which is why I like to include Dramaturge on here instead of ad libitum, and I really don't find myself having much room for anything else when it comes to that. So we're going to move on to the next Now, when it comes to the next lineup, we are actually going to be talking about Bestials. So then we've got double Bestial Lubellion. I think that this is the ideal ratio because Lubellion at 3 can still be pretty cloggy in my opinion. I don't run so many Bestials that I would really benefit from having 3, and at 1, I think that is just too little. I want to see him more often than that. It's pretty much the same reasoning from my previous deck profile as well, but I think that 2 copies just works out pretty nicely, especially since in this deck we've got maybe 3 targets for him, and that includes Branded Beast, Branded Regained, and Branded Lost. So ultimately, at the end of the day, 2 copies is really where it's going to be at. 3 copies would be far too cloggy in my opinion, at the very least in this build. Next up, we've got double Bestial Magnamut. So I've actually taken this down a notch because while Magnamut is a really good card, a fantastic searcher, we're just not really trying to go for too many bestial plays anymore as it is. So I think that 2 is pretty good here. And some of you might definitely want to argue why I'm running some of these ratios, and I think that's understandable. 1, Bestial Saronir, and just a single copy, because I found that if you're going to be running Albion, which is another card that helps you dump another branded spell or trap to the graveyard, and Saronir, do you really need 2 copies of Saronir? I have pondered this question for some time, and I have come to the conclusion that I don't think so. I think that Saronir is totally fine at 1, because we really don't have a lot of targets that we would want to send to the graveyard for his effect anyway, from my experience. So I think that just 1 copy of Saronir is totally fine, and I have never found myself missing having even a 2nd copy of Saronir. So I think that this works out totally fine. And then lastly, for the Bestials, 1 Bestial Druid Worm. I don't run Baldric, because Baldric seems to be maybe just a little bit more situational compared to Druid Swarm. Druid Swarm is just as soon as you send them to the graveyard, you get to send 1 monster on the field to the graveyard. So this is already pretty good removal. It's more generic removal, which is what makes this card better in my opinion. Then next up, we've got some Branded Lost targets. So we are running 1 Albion. This is a fantastic card. It is pretty much like running Upstart Goblin because, and also a copy of Foolish Burial or even Foolish Burial Goods, because you can send a copy of Fallen of Albaz to the graveyard if you need an Albaz in the graveyard, or you can even use this card to send a Branded Spell or Trap like I just said earlier. So this card is really good. After you put this card back at the bottom of your deck, you draw 1. You just get so much with this card. This is just a really good card to run because it is like playing Foolish and Upstart Goblin at the same time, from what I have been able to experience. I like it. He's also searchable through a variety of ways, including Bestial Magnamut. So I like it. Now, this is 1 change that I have gone with, and this is double Mercurier. So double Mercurier isn't really something that I think is all that negotiable in this current format. You can run a copy of Kit instead if you want, because Kit is a beast monster. And I do know that some people like running Kit because it allows you to search for another branded spell or trap. But I don't like Kit personally because it requires you to also put 1 card back into your deck. And I just don't like having to do that. So Tri-Brigade Mercurier, we're running 2 copies because we ideally want to be able to have enough to be able to use 1 to fuse into Rinbrum, and then be able to have another one to still use as a hand trap. So that's my reasoning behind it. That's why I like running 2, and I'm probably going to keep it that way for some time at least. I can see myself lowering this maybe with Cyberstorm Access because I'm going to want to make more room for other cards, but so far at 2, we're doing pretty well. Then we've got triple Effect Veiler. So you might be wondering, why am I playing Effect Veiler instead of running Nibiru or running Ash Blossom? So I think that Ash Blossom might actually be a better card to include in this deck versus Nibiru, or at the very least in the main deck. And my reasoning for that is because at the very least in my locals, people have been, a lot of Kashira players have been running cards such as Sales Band, I believe the card is called. It's a spell card that allows you to declare a monster name, and then your opponent cannot play that card for the rest of that turn. But you, the player of Sales Band, cannot play that card for the rest of this duel. And they tend to declare Nibiru as a result because they are expecting that already. So I don't want Nibiru to be dead when I most need him to be, because a lot of Kishira players have been finding ways of just working around that. So that's why I'm running Effective Ailer instead, and also because it is a light monster, so it would be easier to just dump into the graveyard and then use for one of my bestial plays, or even use her for fusion, since a lot of the fusions are going to involve light or dark. So Effective Ailer has been pretty useful, and if you happen to have 2 copies in your hand, you can use it twice. This is one of those cards that is not going to be once per turn, and it is still going to be pretty useful. Again, I have gone back and forth on whether or not I should have Nibiru in the main deck or not instead of Effective Ailer, but because of Sales Ban, or whatever that card is called, I hope I'm calling it correctly, this card, I think, is just going to be a safer bet. And then the last monster that we're going to run is going to be Dark Magician. So this one right here, I actually kind of want to show it off. This is a Prismatic Secret Rare. This is an Adidas exclusive promotional card that I happened to get my hands on pretty recently, and I think it looks really, really, really cool. So I'm going to be playing this copy, and we were playing Dark Magician because we want to play Red-Eyed Dark Dragoon and be able to get all of his effects going. So this time around, instead of running the Light Hex Fusion, that's what we want to depend on more. So that's why I'm choosing to run Dark Magician instead of the Light Hex Fusion, and I don't regret that at all so far, quite frankly. And there are other reasons why I think that this is a better way to go. So now onto the spells and traps. We are running 2 triple tactics talents. Again, with cards like Nibiru and cards like Ash Blossom running around in the format right now, you do want to be able to capitalize on that when your opponent does utilize cards like that, monsters like that during your turn. You want to be able to use this to either take their monster, maybe take their Shangri-La, or take their Arise Heart, or maybe you want to take it a step further, or a step back and just draw 2 cards. It's just a really useful card in my opinion, and I still think that triple tactics talents is super powerful this format, so I'm going to keep tactics around. I think that it's totally fine at 2. I see it enough, so I don't find myself missing it all that much. Now we've got triple copies of Super Polymerization. In my extra deck, I do not have a lot of super poly targets. In fact, I might have at best around 2, but you can still work around that to make it so that you're still using super poly and still capitalizing on that if you happen to draw it. I'm running 3 because I want to be able to make those super poly targets as often as I can, or at the very least as consistently as I can, I should say. So that's why I'm running 3 copies. And I don't regret it, honestly. I think that Super Polymerization is a very menacing card, and the fact that your opponent cannot respond to it, again, is the saving grace of this card. Then we've got triple copies of Allure of Darkness. This is going to be primarily for consistency. So this card is maybe, I would say that it is still just as good as it was before, because if you end up using this to banish your Mercurier in hand, then you can trigger Mercurier's effect. If you have Tragedy in hand, you can use this to trigger Tragedy's effect. Sometimes that might not be the case. Oftentimes, actually, what ends up happening is that I end up banishing one of the Bestials in my hand, since that's usually what I have greater access to, at the very least right off the bat. But one thing that does end up happening a lot in this deck is that Allure of Darknesses happen to be pretty close to each other, so sometimes I will draw another Allure of Darkness with Allure of Darkness, so then I get to go ahead and use it again and just dig through my deck, dig through more resources, which is something that I personally do like, but not everybody will. So Allure of Darkness stays in my deck. Then we've got double fusion deployment. I'm only running 2 instead of running 3 because I think that this deck is already really tight as it is. I would probably run 3 copies of this card if I had the room in here, but I think that at 2 it is still totally fine. I use it to bring out one of 3 targets. So you can either bring out Fallen of Albaz, Blazing Cartesia, or Dark Magician. Dark Magician is obviously going to be the rarest call for this card, but still, you can get quite a bit of value with it. You are locked into fusions for the rest of this turn. Not that it matters, since we're only running fusions this time around in the extra deck, which is a pretty big change from last time. Then we've got triple Branded Opening. I actually tried running this card at 2 again. I don't like it at 2 because you want to see this card as often as possible. This is an engine starter. So you want to be able to get to your Dramaturge. You want to be able to get to your Aluber. And this card is going to get you there. So to me, it was either running 3 opening or 3 fusion deployments. And I decided to stick with 3 openings because this card is just more immediately useful than fusion deployment. Fusion deployment is a good card, but branded opening is more so of an engine card. So I think that this card is just more valuable to have at 3. Then we've got triple branded fusion. This card, I don't think that it requires much explaining here. But branded fusion is going to be one of the best cards in this entire deck. It is the deck. It is the card that is going to get you going. Now, what sucks the most, obviously, is when this card gets ashed, which is why you want to try to bait your opponent as much as possible by using fusion deployment first, and maybe even using branded opening first if you happen to have the options to do that. Just save your branded fusion until you absolutely have to use it, or until your opponent already tried ashing you. They might wait until you use branded fusion, but luckily you're not entirely dependent on branded fusion in case of anything, since you do have other ways of fusing, other ways of getting to your monsters. Next, we've got 1 branded in white. I'm running branded in white now instead of theater because I think that branded in white, because it does have the ability to fuse from the graveyard as well, and the fact that you're constantly dumping Fallen of Albaz into the graveyard as well, I think that this card just has more utility or more usability than theater does. So I decided to use this card instead, and I didn't really find that theater's secondary effect to bring back fairy monsters was coming up all that much, because unfortunately we do have a smaller Despia engine, so we just don't have as many fairies. Then we've got Branded Regained. This is for the Bestial package. Whenever you banish a light or dark, or your opponent does, as long as it happens at all, you can return that target to the deck and then draw 1 card once per turn. Super good. And you can also bring back a Bestial monster with this card's effect from the graveyard when your opponent special summons. So that's great. 1 Branded in red. This is going to be mostly for the Chimera play, but obviously make this work in any way that you see fit. The Chimera might not be the best option at all times, so just make it work with what you can. The last spell is going to be Branded Loss. Branded Loss is going to get you a ton of cards. There are going to be quite a few targets for it. You're going to have Fallen of Albaz, you're going to have Cartesia, you're going to have Mercurier, as well as Albion. So you do have at least 4 targets to go for from the deck for searching, and it does protect your fusions, which is great. Lastly, for the traps, we've got 1 Branded Retribution. I decided to throw this card in. I don't think that Banishment is as good as it was before, because you're probably not taking your opponent's monsters to fuse with them anymore, at least not as much as before, because Kashira is running on multiple attributes, usually not on light or dark, so it is pretty tough to really justify putting Banishment, in my opinion, on here. So I'm running Retribution instead, because I can dump this to the graveyard, banish it, and then let's say that I can get a card that I had to use for cost, like Branded in white, for example, and then I can go ahead and get Branded in white back and use Branded in white that way. Or let's say Branded in red, I had to use that for cost. It's just a great card for cycling resources, and I think that it is better this format. Then we've got Branded Beast, since we are running enough Bestials to justify the existence of this card. So there are Scareclaw Kashira players out there, which in my opinion are probably the most frustrating to play against, or just like the most complicated matchups. Branded Beast is going to be one of the best ways of getting rid of that Scareclaw monster that keeps all of your monsters in defense position and then is also unaffected by monsters that are in defense position. So Branded Beast is going to be great for that. So that's one case scenario, but obviously there are going to be many more for it. And that's going to be everything for the main deck. Now let's move on to the extra deck. So the extra deck is going to consist only of fusions this time around. And this time we are running 1 Granganol, the Dust Dragon. This card is super easy to make because he just requires a light or a dark, as well as Blazing Cartesia, which is really easy to get your hands on. So you can make him use his effect to dump 1 card from your extra deck. So I usually end up doing Albion, or sometimes I end up doing Alvelenetus. And then I'm able to get an effect at the end phase, but you can also use his effect to bring out another Despian monster from the extra deck. So I think this card is pretty good, but only good at 1, at least right now. Maybe he will be better when we get more support later on with Cyberstorm access, but at this time, 1 copy is more than good enough. Now we've got double Mirror Jade over here. So Mirror Jade at 2 is a card that I don't necessarily see staying for too long. With this deck, I actually don't go for Mirror Jade as often as I used to, but I like to keep 2 Mirror Jades around still in case your opponent goes with Unicorn, and then their first thing to target is probably Mirror Jade, which from my experience actually isn't even the case, so it doesn't really even matter that much. But Mirror Jade obviously is a really powerful card to have around. And you've got Alba Lunetis. You really just want him to be able to dump him to the graveyard as often as you possibly can, so you could grab yourself either Branded Fusion or Fusion Deployment from the deck, since he can grab Fusion Deployment. So Fusion Deployment is searchable, which is another reason why I run it. Then we've got Red Eyes Dark Dragoon. This is the main reason why we are running Dark Magician. Actually, the only reason why we're running Dark Magician. But if your opponent decides to banish any of these cards, oftentimes they will probably want to go for Red Eyes Dark Dragoon. And even if that happens, you don't need Dragoon to win. This is kind of more of a win to more card, if anything. This isn't an absolute necessity to have around. If you have access to a Dragoon, you might as well play it, I think, in Branded, since it is working really well for a lot of people, and it has been working really well for myself as well. Next, we've got One Guardian Chimera. So this card is still going to be as good as ever. Oftentimes what I end up going for is draw 2, pop 1 card, since I really like drawing cards. So I tend to go for that kind of play. And we've got 1 Rinbrum. I also don't really care too much if this ends up getting banished from the extra deck personally, as good as I think this card is. But this is actually also another great target for Grangadal when you send this to the graveyard. So next up, we have got 1 copy of Lubellion. This has not been targeted a single time from my experience with Kashira at all. And honestly, even if it was, we have plenty of ways of cycling through our resources as it is. So it's not that big of a deal if this ends up leaving the extra deck. At least that's just my take. So we've got 2 copies of Albion. I think that this is good enough, really, for getting your resources. Mostly, I tend to use him for dumping him to the graveyard, since we've got multiple cards that do that, such as Grand Guignol and Mirror Jade, to be able to just dump him into the graveyard and be able to search, usually search for Branded in red. Then we've got double copies of Masquerade. I still really like going for 2 copies of Masquerade whenever possible, because this applies a lot of pressure to your opponent. It does take some skill to be able to do. You might not always be able to make 2 Masquerades, but when you make 2 Masquerades, then you know that you're doing pretty well for yourself. Then we've got 1 Despian Corytus. This is one of the targets for Grand Guignol that you can summon. I pretty much only go for him when I'm in a pinch, to be completely honest with you, since my main target ends up being Despian Praskinian. I think Praskinian is much more menacing because it can get over so many cards with 3200 attack, and it can keep you protected with 3200 defense as well. But his effect to be able to summon an extra deck monster from the graveyard has come up so much that I think Praskinian is the target that you should be playing in this deck. And then the last card in the extra deck is going to be 1 Garura. This is going to be the primary super polymerization target. So this is what we would be aiming for as often as possible. And we just got the OCG token for Aluber that I use for my side deck, which I'm going to dive into right now. So next up, we've got triple copies of Nibiru over here. So I keep him in the side again because of Salesban. I hope that I'm saying that card's name correctly. But Salesban, they do end up calling on Nibiru, which means that you can't use Nibiru when you would need him the most, which is when your opponent is playing. So this card, I prefer to keep it in the side for that reason, but I still run it because Nibiru can be such a powerful option in this format. And pretty much only Kashira is running that card anyway to try to stop it. So if you're running up against almost any other matchups, Nibiru is going to still be really good, but obviously still great with Kashira. I do not run Book of Eclipse or Book of Lunar Eclipse either. One, because I think that Book of Lunar Eclipse, or just Eclipse, I think, the red book, that card The fact that it gives you or the opponent the ability to draw cards at the end phase of their turn or your turn is absolutely absurd to me. I don't want to give my opponent that much card advantage, so I just don't play that card at all. I know that it is a very popular side deck option. I don't agree with it personally. Then we've got triple copies of Ghost Spell in case you are dealing with the Mirror. The Mirror is still pretty relevant, especially now that Branded has come back so strong. Then we've got triple copies of Lightning Storm. I think Lightning Storm is a pretty good card if you're going second so that you could throw off your opponent. This is a board breaker that you should absolutely include in your deck whenever possible. Then we've got triple copies of Evenly Matched. This is going to be for more so obvious reasons. Sometimes you will get overwhelmed by a lot of your opponent's monsters, so this is another great board breaker. In my opinion, you should maybe either go for Lightning Storm or Evenly Matched, maybe not both at the same time. But one card, if you're going up against Kashira especially, that you should definitely play is Dimensional Barrier, because it will keep them from summoning Shangri-La, will keep them from summoning a Rise Heart, and while it won't stop their plays completely because they still summon pretty powerful cards, this is still a great card for helping you manage resources, or I should say for having control over the board as is. So this has been pretty much everything for today's deck profile. I most likely will not be updating this particular build in some time because I still have so much playtesting to do with it, and I do want to wait for Cyberstorm access, but let's see how I end up changing this deck up between now and before Cyberstorm access comes out. So if you liked this video, please make sure to leave a like because it definitely helps in the algorithm, and leave a comment also with any of your thoughts and feedback. I'm always open to feedback. Maybe I'm wrong about Book of Eclipse, and I would love to hear your thoughts on that. So with that said, this has been Francisco Ferreira Vlogs. Thank you so much again, and I'll be seeing you all with the updated budget version of this deck pretty soon actually, so enjoy.